Welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Jenny Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. In keeping with our mission to bring timely, fact-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement, tonight we will focus the discussion on the Department of Justice. The U.S. judicial system is rooted in the Constitution. Our system of justice was designed to operate under the rule of law and not to be used for favors or retribution. We read reports of experienced, career prosecutors being removed and replaced by political appointees, and that has raised questions about independence, accountability, and precedent. What's happening with our justice system today? What about the damage that's being done? Is it reversible? Tonight, we are honored to welcome a distinguished panel, experts who are uniquely positioned to answer these and many other questions. The members of tonight's panel are each recognized for their expertise and extensive writings on the rule of law and political violence, and each appear as experts on national media outlets. Please take the time to read their complete and impressive bios on our website, nfrpp.org. Joining us tonight are Mary McCord, the Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Mary has served in the Department of Justice and served for more than 2 decades as an assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Mary writes frequently about political violence and the rule of law for national publications. She is a MS Now legal and national security contributor and co-host of the award-winning MS Now podcast, Main Justice. Asha Rangappa is a senior lecturer at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs and a former associate dean at the Yale Law School. Asha served as a special agent in the New York Division of the FBI, specializing in counterintelligence investigations. She is the author of The Freedom Academy, a Substack that explores how we can develop our moral muscle to stand up for democracy and each other in this critical moment. Asha also co-hosts the legal podcast It's Complicated with Renato Mariotti. She's an editor of Just Security, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and a security fellow with the Truman National Security Project. And Andrew Weissman. Andrew is a professor of practice, teaching courses in national security and criminal procedure. Andrew's career in law is extensive. He was a federal prosecutor, general counsel of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and served as chief of the fraud section in the Department of Justice. Andrew served as a lead prosecutor in Robert S. Mueller's special counsel's office. Andrew serves on the board of and writes frequently for Just Security, and is a co-host with Mary McCord of the popular, almost 3-year-old Main Justice podcast. We look forward to tonight's discussion and to questions from the NFRPP audience. Please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will respond to as many as time allows. Mary McCord, Asha Rangappa, and Andrew Weissman, thank you for joining the Network for Responsible Public Policy. Let's get started.
Thank you, Jenny. And thanks for folks for joining tonight. I want to add one bit to my bio because I think it will become relevant in a moment, which is that in addition to 20 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office, like Andrew started his career as a federal prosecutor in one of the New York offices, both of us ultimately ended up at what we call Main Justice. That's why we have a podcast called Main Justice. And he was in the head of the fraud section. I was the principal deputy and later the acting assistant attorney general for national security. So we bring not only our sort of field AUSA experience, but also our DC Main Justice experience. And that's an appropriate time for those of you who may not have seen it to learn that a brand new, and I don't know if I can actually show this to you on my phone, a brand new banner went up at the Department of Justice today, which is a gigantic photo portrait of our president, Donald J. Trump, saying, "Make America Safe Again." And for those of us who spent long careers at the department and the FBI, which is also part of the Department of Justice, even though sometimes, and Asha can address this, the FBI doesn't want to actually admit that it's part of the Department of Justice. That's an astounding thing to see. The current sitting president, we're here tonight to talk about the lack of independence of this Department of Justice. And it's an astounding thing to see, to have the president put his photo in a huge banner on the Department of Justice. It shows what he thinks of the Department of Justice. So I want to kick us off tonight, before we start to all kind of jump in, by giving a little bit of the history of the independence of the department post Watergate. Probably many of you on this webinar tonight are familiar with the Watergate scandal. It was an instance where there were efforts to co-opt the department by the president. And just 4 years after Richard Nixon resigned in 1978, Attorney General Griffin Bell gave a speech where he wanted to try to the men and women of the Department of Justice to try to reinstill this notion of the independence of the department. And here's some things that he said. He said, "The partisan activities of some attorneys general in this century, combined with the unfortunate legacy of Watergate, have given rise to an understandable public concern that some decisions at justice may be the products of favor or pressure or politics." And although he realized that under the Constitution, there is no constitutional impediment to the president directing the activities of the Department of Justice, he's the head of the executive branch. The Department of Justice is part of the executive branch. Even though there's not a constitutional impediment to it, he said he nevertheless emphasized that the president is best served if the attorney general and the lawyers who assist him are free to exercise their professional judgment. And just as important, they must be perceived by the American people as being free to do so. That started what has been well more than 50 years of policies implemented under every previous attorney general, regardless of party, regardless of who was in the White House, on the independence of the Department of Justice from the White House. And likewise, policies issued by every White House counsel up until now. Even during the first Trump administration, these policies existed that basically limited communications between the White House and the Department of Justice about particular cases or investigations, any directions to take any particular action or any enforcement action in any particular cases. It just said those things shouldn't happen. There can be discussions about between the White House and the political appointees of the Department of Justice about policies and priorities and things like that, but there should not be direction, and this is from the White House counsel as well as the Attorney General, with respect to specific cases. That is all out the window, as we know. I mean, now we have the president tweet to his attorney general, or not tweet, post a social media post on Truth Social to his attorney general to look into, hurry up and get James Comey and Letitia James indicted. And what do you know, within days, those things happen. So we have come a really far way from the post-Watergate reforms. And I want to now open up certainly any comments on that to Asha and Andrew, but also, I think another reason that we are here in the situation we are in now is because of the Supreme Court's immunity decision from July 1st of 2024, a decision that defined the president's core constitutional powers very capaciously and said essentially that his authority over his Department of Justice was conclusive and preclusive. Conclusive meaning Congress can't act upon it, preclusive meaning the courts can't really rule upon it. And that was the case even with respect to if the president were to order a sham investigation. He would be immune from any criminal culpability. Others wouldn't necessarily be, but he would be. And certainly if he directs something that's criminal, he's got the power to pardon. So Andrew and Asha, jumping off from there, like how if you think that set the stage for where we are now or how it contributed to it, let's talk about that.
Andrew?
So I think one of the ways that I think about this is that there are discussions that we can have that have to do with things that are illegal either because they violate a statute or they violate the Constitution, or both. And then there are things that are legal, but just sort of horrendous from a policy point of view. The independence of the Department of Justice from the White House is something that is a norm, but except in certain circumstances, it's not that it's illegal, it's that it is, I think all three of us think it is not the world that we want to live in. And it's not a good way to run a country. When you think about the way that we operate in the United States, it's useful to think about other countries that have dealt with the issue of how do you make the Department of Justice or their version of the Department of Justice independent of the White House or their equivalent of the White House. And an important feature of societies that are not authoritarian is that the rule of law, the mechanics of that, are independent, whether it's by law or by norm. That's important, and it's something that when we lose it, which I agree with Mary, it is now, it's not debatable. It's not an opinion. It is something that is said out loud by the White House, and also just even if they hadn't said it, is just evidenced over and over again. It is very hard to get back, and it's very hard to retrieve the faith and the belief that people have that the Justice Department is working in a blind way to whether you are a political ally or a political foe. The on the Justice Department and the main Justice Department that Mary was describing, that both of us worked in, and Asha was at the bureau. I feel like I'm the bridge because I
You're
was at the
straddling.
bureau.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
at the bureau also, and we can talk about that. It's quite a different environment, and in some ways, in a very, very good way. On the outside of the wall, it talks about, and it's inscribed with the words, "Where law ends, tyranny begins." And that's from a John Locke quote. And the reason I'm referencing it is that, well, we're going to talk about things that are in some ways sort of inside the building, and how much what we're seeing now is completely different than what happened under all previous administrations that we worked in. Um, just to be clear, but that means Republican and Democratic. I think something we all want to stress is that this is not a political issue. This isn't about what policies you might be for, what things you think should be funded or not funded, what you think about taxes or tariffs, or there are all sorts of perfectly legitimate issues, all sorts of issues that where elections have consequences. All of us have served under administrations where we may or may not agree with the policies, but the idea of the independence is something that doesn't just affect the building and what happens in the building. It affects the rights of people on the street, the sort of everyday world. So it's not just attacking sort of core beliefs and how we think of ourselves in the United States, and our view of the United States is supposed to be a sort of shining beacon to the rest of the world. It has true dire effects on people around the country. You could say that to people who are in enormous detention centers in Texas. You could say that to immigrants who the Supreme Court has found 9-0, who were stashed in a prison in El Salvador and left to languish there. You could say this about 6 members of Congress who were criminally targeted for the sin of exercising their First Amendment rights and saying what the law is. You could say this to Letitia James or James Comey or Mr. Abrego Garcia about prosecutions that have all of the hallmarks of authoritarianism, where there's a lack of due process. And before I turn it over to Asha, those examples are where what Mary is talking about, this lack of independence, can cross the line to be something that is not just an example of a norm being broken, but actually a violation of law. In the case of Mr. Abrego Garcia, for instance, the federal judge overseeing his criminal case, not only was he somebody who was illegally extracted from this country, but the court has now said that there is reason to believe that his case is one where he was vindictively prosecuted, which would be a violation of law. And so this is one where it's not only a world we don't want to live in, but as a matter of policy, you need to have an independent Department of Justice, but it is one where it can violate the fundamental rights of people up to and including imprisoning them. And then, unfortunately, when we talk about Minnesota, it will also include people who have lost their lives because of actions that are against the law, in my view.
So I would just add to the historical context that Mary mentioned. I would go further back than Watergate, and definitely from the Bureau's perspective, but also just to zoom back for a second and just look at the Constitution and this idea, the Justice Department is under the executive branch. It's obviously not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. It grows out of the president's duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And, that word faithfully really suggests a fiduciary duty on behalf of the American people. And I think that is something that has been what the Justice Department and the FBI has embodied, that unlike our other intelligence agencies, for example, like the CIA, for whom their ultimate consumer, their ultimate client is the President of the United States, the Justice Department their client is the people. And, that's sort of, I think, the way in which these agencies have traditionally operated. The Bureau in particular, that the norm of independence, I think, is so especially important when it comes to investigations. Because, if you bifurcate this, I mean, you've all watched Law and Order. There's, the investigative part, and then they go into court. A lot of the due process protections kick in once it gets into court. There are, investigative techniques that need to go to court before, during the investigation, but there's a lot that can happen during an investigation, and it is very prone to abuse. And the FBI has a very checkered past in this regard. It was investigated in the 70s for exactly this. And, that is kind of the darker side of the Bureau. But the other side of the Bureau is, for all of his flaws, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the longest serving director. He served under 8 administrations, Republican and Democrat. according to his biographer, Beverly Gage, he never voted in an election because he did not want to feel that he was in any way beholden to a political party or to or a president. And so this norm of independence for sure is what has animated the Bureau when I was there. And I can tell you this, it shocks a lot of younger people when I tell them this, you know, and I know this is probably true for Andrew and Mary too. I went to work every day and I had no idea who my colleagues voted for, or, you know, whether they were, you know, at the time Bush supporters or, you know, Gore supporters or Clinton or whatever, you know, the Democrat du jour was. Um, you just didn't ask that. That was not the motivating part of whether you chose to do something or not. And there was a lot of pride in that, actually. It would have seemed very gauche, you know, to be asking someone about that. So, but I think that, you know, there is room for abuse in this entire process, but that norm of independence is especially important in that investigative phase. And what we see is that when people get targeted for investigations, it even if it doesn't result in charges, it can be incredibly vexatious and harassing and expensive. And so there's all these costs that the president has at his disposal that he can unleash on someone. So I'm just going to add,
I like the unleash it being used just as your cat
just as my
appears.
cat came
That's
in.
great.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, back to unleashing. I mean, this is, you know, back in September of 2024, I testified before the House Judiciary Committee about the impacts of the immunity decision. And one of the things I cautioned about is that if the president's powers really are so capacious that even Congress can't question them, they can't do oversight and question them, and courts can't review the president's conduct involving his discussions with the Department of Justice, that's a quote from the Supreme Court's opinion, then there would be nothing stopping the president from directing the investigation of political enemies, journalists, activists, even if there's no basis for doing so. Because what the Supreme Court said, the majority, was the indictment's allegations that the requested investigations were shams or proposed for an improper purpose do not divest the president of exclusive authority over the investigative, and prosecutorial functions of the Justice Department and its officials. And at the time, I worried that people might think I was being hyperbolic in my testimony before the Justice Department. But we have now seen all of these things happen. We have seen prosecutions, attempted prosecutions of perceived political enemies, right? The former FBI director, James Comey, the New York Attorney General, Letitia James. We have seen now prosecutions of journalists. We have Don Lemon being prosecuted and Georgia Fort based on their coverage of a protest in Minnesota. We've also seen the use of another department or agency of government, the Federal Communications Commission, to try to coerce broadcast networks and others into dropping the programs of those who have made critical remarks about the president. We've seen lawsuits brought by the president against, you know, major media organizations that, rather than defend themselves, have paid many millions of dollars. And we're seeing prosecutions of activists, protesters, many prosecutions rising out of the protests against ICE's surges here in Washington, D.C., in Minnesota, in Portland, Oregon, in Chicago, Illinois, and Los Angeles and elsewhere. And now we even see the announcement that the wife of a person killed by ICE in Minnesota, both were protesting, Renee and Rebecca Good. Renee was killed by an ICE officer, and they are, rather than investigating the force used by that ICE officer, a civil rights investigation, which is completely the par for the course, the ordinary thing to do when a federal law enforcement officer shoots somebody in circumstances like this. One of my colleagues is a former Civil Rights Division prosecutor who did these very cases. Rather than open a civil rights investigation, they instead opened an investigation into the wife and activist and protester Rebecca Good. So all of these things that we worried could happen because of the permission that this immunity decision seemed to give to the president to do whatever he wants, those things are coming to fruition. And even though, it could be that those who carry out the president's directives could face some accountability at some point, at least when it comes to criminal accountability, if the president, I expect that at the end of his term, will try to pardon every single person he can think to pardon, so that at least the criminal accountability is not one of those tools. So I guess I'm interested to know, in addition to these political prosecutions, one of the earliest things that happened after inauguration this past year was the firing of the January 6th investigators and prosecutors, and the acting attorney general, right, putting out a directive, Asha, to the FBI to cough up the names and information about FBI agents all over the country who at any point worked on the January 6th investigation, and what was their role and what did they do. And this is really unprecedented, and I think was one of the earliest obvious signals that this really was going to be an administration that was about retribution and retaliation, which of course the president had been saying when he was campaigning, and that would be the priority. And Asha, when you saw that kind of go out to your former colleagues in the FBI, I wonder what your reaction is, and I'm sure you've talked to many of them, and I've talked to a lot of them myself about, and it's not just their reaction, because I'm sure they saw some of it coming, but what's the damage that that does, right, to the FBI?
I mean, the FBI is decimated, as is the Justice Department, right? Most people in the Bureau, I would say the majority of people are career people. Like, they stay there for 20 years, which means that they gain a lot of experience. And to stay there for 20 years, in particular to get into those senior levels, they've rotated through different areas. So they have counterterrorism experience, they have counterintelligence experience. They know a lot. And just, as a new agent coming in, you go through Quantico, but you're relying on the people who've been there and their knowledge to get passed down, and also norms to get passed down. So, the damage has been done in morale for sure. I mean, I think people that are still left are deciding whether or not to stay, but the sheer number of people have left, the decades of experience that have gone, actually makes us less safe. And it leaves people, it leaves us with an agency that is not going to be equipped to deal with many of the threats that we need to address. And I think that that's something that gets lost in this, because we get focused on the political side, but there's a lot. I did counterintelligence. There are threats coming from our foreign adversaries. There are terrorists who seek to harm us. There are crimes going on, trafficking, white collar crime, all these things that are not being addressed. And I'm interested to hear what you think in terms of, well, first, I mean, the damage at justice, but also it's unclear to me how this gets fixed. So anyone who's listening who thinks that this is just going to be, if there's a change in administration, we go back to normal, that is not going to happen. It can't. It is now damaged to a degree that it is going to require a reconstruction of some sort, because you actually have to build up the lost experience, the culture, the norms, and all of that has been, decimated.
Mhm.
Just on that, I think it's really important for people to understand that if we do at some point have a normal administration, and by that I mean regardless of it being Republican or Democratic, it's just a return to what all of us have lived through. It is not clear for the Bureau in particular where people go to make their career. If you think every 4 years, all of this could be for naught because you will be asked to do things that are illegal. You'll be targeted for working on a case that is politically sensitive to the next administration. Why are you going to do that? There is no longevity I can't underscore enough for the Bureau in particular, and it's true at other parts of the intelligence community where people make their careers. The Department of Justice, it can be a little bit more episodic where people go in and out. Um, you really, really need that. Asha and I at the Bureau saw that day in and day out. The senior people with the experience and judgment are absolutely vital to not just making good decisions, but making truly life and death decisions for the country. And so it is extremely hard with this administration and the precedent they set, as well as they're trying to completely eradicate the idea of civil service, which is legally instilling that idea that people can come and in an apolitical way make their career and do justice and not be thinking about doing this because my boss for in time A wants it because it's a political ally or political foe. The one thing I just wanted to add to this discussion of the weaponization, true weaponization of the department, is that there's sort of another coin to that. It's not just who gets targeted, investigated, and prosecuted, but it's also who does not. And Mr. Homan, who people sort of looked at as, oh, thank goodness Mr. Homan has gone into Minneapolis and has replaced Mr. Bovino in overseeing what happened there. He is somebody where the reports are that he took a bag of cash. I think it was a Kava paper bag with $50,000. That is not under investigation, with the extremely bogus argument being made by the department that, well, there's no evidence he committed a crime.
Isn't it on video?
Well, supposedly it is on video. You
Yeah.
would think that if you had not done something wrong, that if it was Mary McCord or Asha Rangappa who had that claim and you had not done anything wrong, the first thing that you would do is say, I want that made public. Put everything out there. You could say the same thing if you're the president of the United States and there's nothing to hide with connection with the Epstein matters. And remember, this is now talking about a public official. A public official, as all three of us know, your oath, your duty is to the public. You work for the public, not vice versa. You would think that the first thing you would do is tell your Justice Department, I want every single document, every single photo that involves me to be put out. And I want you to make a statement, and I will make a statement saying that everything that involves me has been made public. That hasn't happened. And the other example of sort of the non-prosecution is if you see what appears to be, by all accounts, horrendous violence against people in Minnesota, citizens and non-citizens, none of whom are to be treated without due process or subject to agents who don't understand when you can use deadly force and when you cannot use deadly force. If after the shooting of Renee Good and if after the shooting of Sosie Selly, who fortunately did not die, if after the shooting of Alex Preddy, the very first things that you hear as an agent is, one, that you have complete immunity. Two, that everything you did without any investigation being done was a good shoot, that you have no liability. If in the case of Mr. Sosa-Selly, you're going to have your leaders say that the reason that you could shoot him is because he attacked you with a shovel, which of course turned out to be false. If you are told that you will not be investigated and that instead the victim will be, or the victim's wife will be investigated. The message to those people is that the law will not touch you, that you will not be held responsible, that you can be Mr. Homan and take a bag of cash and you won't have to explain it to anyone, that you can be on Signal Gate and discuss clearly classified information, in my view, about the imminent attack that we were going to undertake with people on an unclassified system, and there would not be any investigation. When, by the way, all three of us know that in any other administration, Republican or Democratic, that would never, ever happen, that there would be an investigation. The message is that the rule of law does not apply as long as you're doing something that we think is beneficial as a policy matter, and even if it is a violation of law, and even if the result of that violation of law is the death or shooting of an American citizen or of anyone, whether they're an American citizen or not. You're announcing to them that you do not have to worry about the rule of law. And so that's the other side of weaponization, is the announcement that there's sort of immunization of those people.
Can I jump in on that one point real quick? Because I know we're talking about prosecutions, but I think it's also worth mentioning just the refusal to enforce laws, or, the TikTok ban, for example. And I know probably people watching this are not super upset that that was not enforced, but that was one that was a duly enacted law that the Justice Department actively told people we're not going to prosecute you, which, it's just really not in their remit. The Epstein files is another law that they are not observing. And on the loss of expertise front, I just also want to highlight, with the Nancy Guthrie case going on with Charlie Kirk, we see a lot of these fumbles that I just don't think we would have seen prior to so many agents being let go. So I just wanted to add those 2 points as well.
Asha,
Mary.
weren't you just on the Charlie Kirk uh, uh, murder? That's one where I was just shocked, because both of us have been sort of on the ground, and when we've seen, unfortunately, other horrendous murders, and the Bureau typically would be out front and in the lead, and of course they would pair with state and locals. But here, thank goodness that law enforcement got lucky in that the family, by all accounts, really exerted a lot of pressure on the person who's now accused of that crime to come forward. But that's not how you run law enforcement, is counting on getting lucky. And it was remarkable to me that the FBI was not out in the lead. That the reports are that the announcement of and going public and taking an investigative step that was quite important was, by all accounts, delayed simply so that the FBI director could be at the press conference and show his face, when the Bureau wasn't even going to be, by at least that role was not going to have any importance in terms of the investigation, by all accounts. It's a real sense of that enormous lack of expertise. One thing I like to say is there anyone who could say that the people we have at the very top of the intelligence community and the law enforcement community are the very best people for the job? Which should be the only criteria for a selection. It's what the public is owed. And you just can't say that. By all accounts, what the criteria is this somebody who is going to have a complete and total fealty to the White House, not just on a policy matter, but on a direction to do exactly what the White House wants about who gets targeted and who doesn't. That is so dangerous, to your point, Asha, about not having the expertise when you need it. And all three of us have been in that position where, especially when we're starting out, just being in awe of and learning from the senior people at the department, at the bureau, who really gave you that example of what it means and what's necessary to keep the country safe.
That brings me back to the point that Asha made that I really want to just emphasize for folks, and I'm kind of glancing through the Q&A, and I want to kind of address some of the thoughts in there, which is that like you, Asha, I mean, almost 25 years at the department, and other than the political appointees, and in the U.S. Attorney's Office, people should know there are many, many prosecutors in U.S. Attorney's Office, but in each office, there is only one political appointee, and that is the United States Attorney. And many of the other prosecutors have been there decades, and, we are all career. And when you get over to Main Justice, there are more political appointees because there's the Attorney General, and Deputy Attorney General, and Assistant Attorney Generals. But then there are some, like myself, I was always career even when I was there. And so you did not talk about politics. You did not know who voted for who. You did not talk about whether anybody was a Democrat or a Republican. Partly there's the Hatch Act and you don't want to run afoul of it, but it was really because it was irrelevant, because every one of us there was busy with what we were investigating or working on. We are trying to, bring people to justice who have committed crimes. We're trying to seek resolutions that are favorable for victims of crimes, whether these are white-collar crimes or violent crimes or drug crimes or sex trafficking. I prosecuted sex trafficking for a while. We are on appeal. We are defending convictions. If we see that there was an error, we are conceding that. Like you were telling the court the good, the bad, and the ugly. Like we had an obligation under the Constitution to advise defendants of any kind of evidence or information we might have, even if it wasn't admissible evidence that would suggest the person didn't commit the crime, or that one of our witnesses or some of our evidence, maybe they, had a little baggage with it. Like these are all part of our obligations. And this is the kind of thing that we just did every day. And so, there's some questions in the Q&A kind of about these norms of independence, should those be codified? And so codification, like if Congress were to pass a law, you might run into a separation of powers problems, right? Because again, the president is the head of the executive branch, and the Department of Justice is part of that executive branch, and the president has given the authority to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And the Supreme Court now has said he has plenary authority, conclusive and preclusive authority over his Department of Justice. So there could be challenges to a law like that. But the reason I think that law has not been needed, and it's not like the department or the FBI have always been perfect, and it's not like there haven't been scandals and, incidents of corruption or misuse of resources, but by and large, the people, both career and political appointees, have wanted the American people to believe that the Department of Justice operated independently and was not just an arm of the president to use for political purposes. People took pride in what they did, even political appointees, that this is a department that is going to follow the facts and the evidence where it leads. And when there are violations of law and they implicate important federal interests, they're not petty, they're not vindictive, right? But when they're, important things, counterterrorism, counterintelligence cases, white-collar fraud cases, healthcare fraud, major antitrust violations, civil rights violations, major drug cartels, sex trafficking. Those are things that there's an important federal interest in, and no one that I worked with ever wanted any member of the public to think that we were just doing something because the president wanted us to do it, or that we were not doing something because the president didn't want us to do it. And policies change under presidents, and there might be emphasis on foreign corrupt trade practices cases, or emphasis not on those like we have right now. There's been emphasis on, drug crimes and firearms crimes, and there have been time, well, that's not the high priority. It doesn't mean you don't do them, it just means they want to shift some resources. And that's a very different thing. But I think what this administration has told us both at the Department of Justice, but across the federal government, is that a lot of things that we have relied on for the history of this country to preserve our democratic republic are based on people wanting to preserve it and people self-moderating, and the three branches of government working in self-moderation, right? Congress and the executive have, been at loggerheads many, many times over our history, but one side doesn't just steamroll the other and say, I don't care about your constitutional powers. I'm going to do whatever I want and be damned with you. They try to work it out, right? They try to work it out because they saw the value in working it out to preserving democracy. And so I think what has come as, I'm not going to say things are a shock, because I think, this president was telling us what he was going to do while he was campaigning, and we saw a preview of it in his first administration. It's on steroids this administration, but I think it's still a surprise to me, at least, to see so many people willing to forego all of these things I'm talking about. Just even if you just focus on the Department of Justice, willing to forego this notion of an independent Department of Justice that makes its decisions based on the facts, on the law, and not on what the White House said. And when you watch somebody like the Attorney General last week go and sit before Congress and just be a mouthpiece of the president, and being belligerent with the members of Congress at a hearing, and I've seen this repeatedly, it's just, it is shocking to me to see that people don't seem to care at all about the perception to the American people that the Department of Justice is there to do justice without fear or favor.
And Mary, I would add that it's not just that we took pride in it. You actually needed people to believe that to do your job. I mean, when I was an agent, I did counterintelligence, so I didn't necessarily have things to hold over somebody's head. Like, you're gonna go to jail if you don't talk to me.
Yeah.
Like, I would knock on doors, and I would need people to want to talk to me because they believed in what the FBI did. That the FBI were the good guys. They're doing things that are worthwhile. They're going to do things honestly and above board. And I think, Mary, this gets to the point of for agents and prosecutors, and when they go into court, they need that credibility for courts to take them seriously and for courts to believe that what they are saying is done in good faith, that it is coming out of normal processes. And we can talk about the presumption of regularity. I think this is so important, and I talk about it a lot, when I'm trying to explain. And the presumption of regularity is this benefit of the doubt that the court gives to the executive branch, believing that, okay, when you present these findings that, for example, this country is no longer dangerous and therefore we are going to lift temporary protected status, that you have actually gone through some, bona fide, good faith, expertise-driven research to come to that conclusion, not just because, that's something that you want to put on your next, social media clip. And what we are seeing is court after court. And this is what I say to people. Don't look at me, look at the, court opinions from across the board, including from many Trump appointed judges who are saying, you have come into my court and you have said things that are misleading, that are inaccurate. In some cases, they're saying you have lied.
Yes.
And just so people understand, that means in all of those cases that, Mary mentioned, the ordinary cases of crime, that means that judges are gonna be more wary, juries are gonna be more wary. It makes the job itself harder.
Well, one of the things that all three of us are focusing on is not just sort of the short term, the litigation now, the discussion about what is going on now, and not even sort of longer term, which we'll talk about, which is at the midterms and the concern over that. But it is much longer term, the natural question that people would have, well, what can be done? And one of the things that obviously something that you could do is amend the Constitution, because obviously the biggest issue here is that you have at least the current Supreme Court and the majority there that isn't changing anytime soon, saying that under the sort of unitary executive theory that and within the scope of the power of the president is his communications with the Department of Justice, even as Mary said, the court said, even directing a sham investigation. Just pause on that for a moment. The Supreme Court has said that even where an indictment has been brought by a grand jury, that a person ordered a sham investigation into alleged fraud in Georgia, even if that was a sham, that is protected as being solely within the power of the executive. So one way to obviously change that would be to amend the Constitution. The reason you probably don't hear a lot of talk about that is because how hard it is to do, and people are trying to figure out what can be done short of that within the framework that, especially with this Supreme Court, would work. And I agree with Mary that one of the ways to do that is you're thinking about what can you do that's not just a norm, because if it's a norm, meaning that any new president can just be like, and that's gone, is for Congress to at least be trying to exert its power in ways, and obviously not to do it overtly, to think they're going to do something that they know is unconstitutional, but to do things where we didn't think we'd have to be there. The Department of Justice is an agency that is created by Congress. It is funded by Congress. It always seemed, this is where I'm going to bring out my sort of inner New York, Brooklyn, which is, so maybe not that my parents were probably going the thousands of dollars of Ivy League education out the window for an analysis that is, I don't understand how you have the power to create the agency. You have the power to fund. That means also not to fund the agency. You have the power to decide that you're going to direct funding only for certain things and not for other things. Well, one of the things you could do is say, we're only going to fund under these conditions. We're only going to fund if there is respect for civil service. The administration currently is trying to eradicate all protections for civil service. Well, Congress can push back and say, not only are we going to pass laws to make sure that cannot happen, meaning that the president would be violating the law, and that means that the courts could issue injunctions to say it cannot be done, but to also use its spending power. This is one where you could be sure if Donald Trump were a congressional leader, he would have, one thing he is very good at is figuring out where his levers of power. And Congress has those tools. And that's where this audience comes in, where everyone here has the ability to speak up, to talk to their representatives, to make their voices heard about what they want, what they don't want. I can assure you that political leaders focus on a number of things, but one is they are very attuned to what the populace is upset about, the volume of calls and letters they get, how the intensity in terms of how much people are concerned about it. In other words, not just the number, but just how forceful people are in terms of expressing how important they are. And that is true whether you live in a blue or red state or purple state, that people are focused on that. And so I've gotten that question from people a lot, which is, well, I live in Boston, who's going to really care? And the answer is a lot of people care. And it fortifies those politicians to know that they're the people who they support and represent have those views and will back them if they are doing things that are really necessary to have true separation of powers. And, the theory, just to be a little highfalutin, is that the way you preserve liberty is by diffusion of power. That is the reason why you have three branches of government. That is the reason that while it may be unpleasant for politicians, whether in the executive branch or the legislative branch, or for judges in the judiciary to have a very strong press, it is really important. Even if you think sometimes the press is irresponsible, even if you think sometimes their questions are too tough or don't get the facts right, that is what it means to live in a healthy democracy. And I can assure you, around the globe, the United States is viewed widely by people that respected the United States and what it stood for as a failing democracy, in terms of its democratic institutions eroding before their eyes. And I'm confident that people here listening to this are here because of that concern. And I know it's not like a panacea to say that you can speak up, but it is worth remembering that you do have representatives to voice all of that, and you still have a First Amendment right to do all of that. And I should say, because of people like Mary, there are incredible institutions and legal outfits at the forefront of defending people who are being targeted and challenging laws that are and actions that are illegal with enormous success.
I want to, some of the things you said there make me want to spend a little bit of time with both of you talking about what's happened recently in Fulton County and our concerns for the midterms. We've talked about political prosecutions, prosecutions of journalists and protesters. And I think this is a very deliberate effort to silence people. Recall also that early in this administration, the president went after law firms and basically blacklisted law firms that had represented people or causes with which he disagreed. And that was an effort to get the rest of the, bar, the rest of the lawyers to be too afraid to ever challenge this president, that they would just stop doing that and you would not really have an adversary process. And the whole idea of going after protesters, nonprofits, is to suppress people from exercising their constitutional rights, suppress nonprofits from helping people exercise their constitutional rights. And, I think a lot of this has been laying the groundwork to try to suppress the vote this fall in the midterms, and also to create a sort of a normative narrative that there's no way there can be a free and fair election, and prepare the population for potentially the seizure of ballots, the seizure of voting machines, federal armed agents at polling places, things that are going to be baseless. And in fact, armed federal agents at polling places is also unlawful and criminal. But, I don't think this Department of Justice would prosecute that. So the burden is going to be on the rest of us to find ways to challenge that. But I think we saw that groundwork really being laid with the Fulton County search. We're talking about, again, the seizure of ballots and tabulating machines and everything relating to an election that is now, 6 years ago, that is in the rearview mirror, that was investigated up and down 10 ways to Sunday, with no substantial evidence of fraud found in any of the 65 cases that were brought. One case was a minor, one case in Pennsylvania that resulted in some relief was such a minor minor incident of misconduct that it wouldn't have made any difference, and certainly nothing in Fulton County, Georgia. But so I guess I'm interested in your reactions, and Andrew and I already talked about this on our podcast. And I guess two things really stood out to me. One is the fact that every assertion in the affidavit in support of the search warrant was something that has been well known, that's been investigated, that's been rejected as being anything that caused any real concern about this election. But perhaps more importantly to me, as somebody who'd been a former prosecutor and had reviewed plenty of search warrants, is a search warrant has got to have probable cause that a crime was committed, and that just didn't exist in this affidavit. There was first of all, the two crimes supposedly being investigated, the statute of limitations is passed, but even more importantly, there were twice, I think, in the affidavit, an FBI agent said that if there was evidence that these things were done intentionally, then that could be a crime. Well, that's not what you put in a search warrant affidavit, for any of you that don't know. What you have to say is, here is the evidence that some person, X person, by name usually, did something intentionally. We have this that shows it was intentionally. He said he was going to do it, right? To do it intentionally. We have this, an email that says it. You put forth the evidence of intentionality. Your warrant doesn't say if there was an intentional act here, there might be a crime. So I was pretty shocked that a magistrate judge signed it. I was pretty shocked that an FBI agent ever submitted it. And, the other thing that Andrew and I have talked about is there was a lot of things left out of that, like what we would call, and I referred to it earlier, the exculpatory and impeaching information, the information that would have suggested actually that there was no crime, that there were no anomalies that were significant, and then information about the people that were the so-called witnesses relied on in this affidavit, and the fact that many of them were the cast of characters who have been baselessly alleging election fraud ever since 2020, but that was not told to the magistrate judge. So I want to get your reactions, both of you. Asha, I'm particularly interested in what you think about this FBI agent, but also just like, where do you see this? Because I think this is very dangerous in terms of the precedent is trying to set as we go into these midterms.
Yeah,
And then we will end on a high note, people.
I think it's important to give some context for that particular search warrant too, which is that the special agent in charge of the Atlanta field office, which would have overseen that, the request for that search warrant, resigned.
Yes.
6 days before because of this case. And someone had asked in the Q&A, where are the people in the Justice Department, not speaking, why aren't they speaking out? Look at the resignations. Our mutual colleague, Mimi Roca, had a great analogy where she said the resignations are like the carbon monoxide alarms. Like they are telling you where the danger is. And so when you see these people resigning and leaving, that's, it's danger. And, we saw this in Minneapolis. Minnesota, where prosecutors resigned because they were being told to investigate the victim's wife. And that, they know that is simply not the basis. So
half the office has left.
Yes.
My old office in DC, I think almost half that, at least a third of that office is left.
So the resignations are, speaking volumes. But then, so it seems to me that if the SAC resigns, then at that point, the whole office there gets the message that this is probably not something you want to touch. And I'm assuming that they then found someone who was willing to put their name on it. And to Andrew's point about, I forget, actually, one of you made this point about the
Asha,
deterrent.
can I just say
Mm-hmm.
the SAC is special agent in charge. By the way, welcome
Oh,
to
sorry.
if you work in the government, it's all acronyms all the time. So when Asha was talking about the supervisory special agent in charge, the SAC, that was the person in Atlanta who resigned. That's the head of the office in that particular region.
Yeah, so I mean, when the boss of your whole office resigns, and it's clear that this is why, that's a clue, as we would say in the FBI, that this is not something you want to do. What was shocking to me, Mary and Andrew, is the willingness of an agent to put their name on that because of the consequences that flow from that. That is career ending. I mean, there has been a motion that's been filed that said all of the things that Mary said, that is asking for a return of the property because of all of these false statements. And also, to your point, Mary, you don't go and ask for a search warrant until you've done some investigation, as you said, and you actually have this evidence. And all of the evidence was just these witnesses, like hearsay about, I saw somebody write a note that said, Vince miscounted or something like that. I mean, it was kind of crazy. But what's shocking to me is that those deterrent effects aren't there anymore. I mean, that was drilled into us as agents. You must be above reproach. And especially if you exhibit lack of candor in something, if you, file something that is not accurate, we're never going to be able to use you on a case. We can never put you on the stand again. Because then we're going to have to disclose that background to the defense, and they're going to impeach you as soon as you get up there to testify. So you're going to be sitting at a desk pushing paper for the rest of your career. That's pretty much like and so I don't know what is happening. Because that wasn't just a one-off misstatement in that affidavit. It is a whole, I mean, it's a whole, affidavit filled with what appear to be conspiracy theories.
And another thing, and then Andrew, I'm not trying to jump in here, but I am, which is that it's not just that, the special agent in charge resigned and this guy came in. Like the U.S. attorney in Georgia is not the one who's handling this case, right? They found somebody in Missouri and brought this person in to be in charge of examining elections nationwide, right? In D.C. just last week, when they completely and utterly failed in trying to indict the 6 members of Congress who are all former military and intelligence, who put out a video just reminding our military officers that they can refuse illegal orders. And there was an attempt to prosecute them for that. And the grand jury overwhelmingly said, no, we're not going to do it. It wasn't the career prosecutors that went into that grand jury. It was 2 political people that the U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro picked. We're seeing hand-picked people, right? When nobody in the Eastern District of Virginia would prosecute James Comey or Letitia James, they pulled in a prosecutor, and I hate to say it, a lot of these are from Missouri, pulled in a prosecutor from Missouri to do it. And somebody in the questions is asked about competence. We have a real lack of competence here at the department.
Which might be a good thing.
Maybe.
In some ways.
So what I was going to say about the Fulton County affidavit from the FBI agent is it is when this lack of evidence in the affidavit about this being intentional and not just a mistake, and intentionality that you have to be able to set forth probable cause. It is fair for an agent to say, here's sort of circumstantial evidence. We don't have a confession from somebody saying it was intentional, but here's the evidence from which you could find probable cause and infer that it was intentional. And it's, to me, the thing that I do not just fault the agent and the Department of Justice, because I don't, as I said to Mary when we were covering this in our podcast, like, Mary McCord was never going to let this go through, and not because of politics. It's like, Asha would never put her name on it. Mary would never have approved it. Is that it was such a tell to the judge that the agent said twice, well, if this was intentional, the way that these would read if you didn't have direct evidence would be that the agent would say, I have this expertise, and based on this, I see that this is intentional and this is probable cause, and I have made that conclusion based on these facts. And the fact that the agent didn't go that far, to me, meant that the agent was definitely had some concerns about this and was not going to sign that whatever line he decided he was going to have. And I'm not justifying his signing it. I'm just saying there clearly was I think, a huge red flag to the magistrate that it didn't read that way. It didn't read like a normal search warrant where you have something saying if. That's the kind of thing that Asha and Mary, if they were reviewing it beforehand, would have been like, what do you mean if? I need to know
Do you
from
think
what facts are you going to infer that there's intent? Because if there's no intent, there's no crime. Crimes require something to be intentional, not a mistake. So that's why it's people who have read so many search warrant applications. This stood out to us, and that is the area. Well, a judge does not have to be fly specking and investigating, and is at least in a normal administration supposed to be able to take at least the good faith of the agents and prosecutors in front of them. Here, seeing that affidavit, and then knowing how much had been investigated and publicly investigated that was not included in the affidavit, I do think that there's substantial questions about why the magistrate signed this and found probable cause. As Asha said, and something for people to keep their eye on, is there is litigation now on that very issue. Because as we speak, the only copy of the actual original ballots have been removed by the Bureau, are in the hands of the executive branch, and that is the sole original copies. And there's
That's
not
terrifying.
exactly.
Well,
And so keep your eye on that litigation in terms of, and the filing has been made challenging the affidavit and pointing out in much greater detail the things that Asha, Mary, and I have been talking about the submission that was made to the magistrate judge.
I was thinking to Mary's question on, where we think this goes from here as a strategy. I mean, one silver lining might be that just because this was so, such a clown show in terms of how they presented it, now this motion has been filed. Um, I'm not sure what the judge is going to say. I don't know how often a judge says, "Oops, I got it wrong," and has the humility to do that, or maybe there's an off ramp.
This is the district court judge. He's reviewing what the magistrate did.
Oh, okay. I thought it went back to the magistrate judge. Okay, so there is a review. Okay. It kind of does put a spotlight on it so that if this gets tried again, maybe it won't be successful. And in some ways, I think this is where I was saying that the incompetence might be a blessing in some ways, because there are so many instances I see where there is a much more nefarious way that something could have been done
Yes.
that would have been upheld by the court.
Yeah.
And what is actually getting in their own way is their contempt for any rules at all whatsoever, any rules and any procedure at all whatsoever. So if you look at, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that case about the temporary protected status for Haitian refugees, which Christy Noem lifted. And this, that got litigated. And the judge is saying, you didn't do anything to look into this. Like, you didn't even pick up the phone and call other people. And I mean, in other words, there's some very basic procedural things that you could do the kabuki dance and pretend that you're following the
Create a
statute.
record, right?
And then it would make it much harder for these judges. And, I think there are similar things in other cases, and they're not even doing that. And it's not clear whether it's because they don't know they're supposed to do it. I personally think it's that they're contemptuous of it and they don't feel like they should be asked to do it. I have no idea. It could be a combination of both,
There-
but it is, as in this case with Fulton County, then it comes back to bite them in the butt.
And the retaliation, the retribution, I mean, there's one thing about this administration, they are transparent when it comes to retaliation and retribution. And like in the recent case that brought by Senator Kelly to challenge, the Secretary Hegseth's attempt to, demote his rank in his retirement and reduce his pay, it's so obvious that it was in retaliation for his free speech. And the judge, in saying it's like, this is such an obvious thing. If they were more conniving and scheming, maybe they could hide it, but they don't care to. And I think that's where you're right, that in a way that's helpful. And that leads to the bright spot. I mean, it's a horrible thing to see the Department of Justice making such complete horse feathers, Andrew, arguments. That was a term used by Judge Leanna in the Kelly case. But the bright spot is judges are seeing through it. Judges, at least at the district court level, are saying no. They're saying, you guys are not credible anymore. The presumption of regularity is gone because you have not been following due process or procedures, and I'm not going to give you that benefit of the doubt. And grand juries are refusing to indict cases that are not fact-based, and petit juries, meaning the juries after trial, like in the famous case here of Sandwich Guy, are refusing to convict people where they don't think the evidence supports it. And so the rest of our sort of like outside of the Department of Justice, people like those of you on this call who might sit on juries or grand juries, judges, they are, I think, really standing up. And, we've got to give them a whole lot of support to get through these next few years. But Jenny, since we are at 8:15, I know I've been looking at the Q&A and trying to kind of weave some responses in, but there's a lot we didn't get to. And if we want to spend the last few minutes on a few questions we didn't get to, we are happy to do that.
Great. Yeah, no, you've done a great job of weaving in some of the questions we've had. So here's one that kind of comes out of the conversation about Fulton County. How does the Constitution balance state sovereignty over elections with federal enforcement responsibilities when the DOJ intervenes in voting-related cases?
Well, I'll start us off, but the Constitution makes it pretty clear. It's the states that have the responsibility for administering elections, and Congress can step in sometimes with some of the dates and times and things like that. But it is, who it is not? It is not the president, and it is not the Department of Justice. Department of Justice, yes, can investigate crimes like election fraud and like voter intimidation and things like that. But when it comes to the actual administration of the elections, they don't have that power. So when the president says we want to nationalize the elections, that's just not a thing. He can't do it. He may want to do it, but he doesn't have the authority to do it. Where I get worried though is on potentially bogus conspiracy theories about election fraud, which is within the power of the executive branch to investigate. That's where you could see things like the seizure of ballots in the coming election, or things like that take it out of the hands of the state and locals and into the hands of the feds, who, as spent most of my adult life working for the Department of Justice, I just don't trust them anymore.
Can I add one more thing to that? I think the only other wild card is the national security fig leaf.
Yes. 100%.
The national security fig leaf is kind of the claim that the government makes, that this is a matter of national security. So, we believe that Italian satellites,
Yes.
hacked the voting machines, and therefore we need, to look, it becomes an intelligence matter and a
Yes.
counterintelligence matter. That's, it's far-fetched. I don't even know that we've gamed out like how that would look like, because it's kind of crazy, but it has been hinted at.
Yes. Yes.
And I think it could go
Tulsi
there.
Gabbard was there in
Right.
Fulton County.
So that was one of the things that was quite interesting when the affidavit by the FBI agent was made public, was whether it was going to contain anything that would justify why Tulsi Gabbard was there, because obviously we all lived through these absolutely insane ideas that Hugo Chavez or Italians, or insert your crazy conspiracy theory about some foreign government somehow magically hacked into the election, and there's never been any evidence of that. And so when the affidavit came out, one of the things that was noticeable was that the amount that was said about any sort of international hacking or foreign interference was zero. And so while there was this performative aspect of people showing up, in my view, to sort of get attention from the one person that they are performing for, namely Donald Trump, there was no evidence of that. But the concern is, although even various members of the Supreme Court, including Amy Coney Barrett, have nodded to the issue of the limited role that the president has in national elections, this concern that, and the Wall Street Journal has written about this, that Tulsi Gabbard is going to issue some kind of bogus report. She has already done that in the past. That says that there's a real concern about hacking and fraud, and that will be used by the Department of Justice to seize ballots, to monkey with the midterms. For people who are very worried about this, as we are, you should know there are a lot of lawyers focusing on this issue and being prepared to take steps so that that kind of activity doesn't happen. Some of it would require a court to approve it, and so that is where there needs to be a lot of education and talk and work done, because obviously you're hearing from three people who think that the warrant on its face that was signed by the judge in the Fulton County matter that it should not have happened because we don't see probable cause. And that this is, democracy is going to be like it was in connection with January 6th, can come down to inches. Very important few people acting with fortitude, like the former vice president, and many others, and it's going to be necessary that that doesn't happen again, and we don't have sort of a weak link with somebody signs off on something that should not have been signed.
Okay, just shifting gears a little bit here. We have a question that says, for students preparing to enter federal investigative careers, how do we reconcile a commitment to evidence-based justice with a growing public narrative that federal institutions are politicized? Many of us feel that stepping into government service right now is intimidating because global and domestic trust in the United States seems shaken. What responsibility does the next generation of investigators have in rebuilding credibility, and is the system structurally capable of earning that trust? Big question.
I'm going to talk very briefly, but you're talking to three people who we all teach, and we all deal with students, and I say that I was just teaching today, and I say this to obviously keep politics out of the classroom. You want to make sure you're teaching to everybody. As we've said, this is not a political issue. That it is so important for the public to have the best and the brightest in public service, and that it's only going to work if people are not deterred from engaging in public service. It doesn't mean that everyone will feel like this is the perfect time to go into the federal government, because they may feel like they can't stomach it, but it's so important, just as we saw after the sort of pink pussycat protests around the country. We saw this huge influx of people into the political process because they wanted to make change. It's so important for young people to not say that they're going to do something else because it's too difficult. It is difficult, but as various mentors of mine have said, democracy is difficult. We have a history in this country for centuries of having very difficult moments and difficult battles, and we have a lot of people to look up to and to be role models for being courageous and doing real public service.
Asha, do you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add. I mean, I think, the question I'm reading it. I mean, I think the question of what to do right now and what to do what can be done in the future, I think are two different things. I mean, right now it's a challenging time for people to go in. And what I have been telling students, I would never dissuade anyone from public service, but I tell them they need to have a very strong moral compass in place before they go, and they need to know what their lines are, and they need to never take a job that they can't leave. And that line might actually come in the interview process because there are reports of people being hired who are being asked to state that they will be loyal to the president of the United States, which is not something that's normally asked in, when you're taking these jobs. You take a loyalty to uphold the Constitution. So it could be, in that process, it could be on day one, it could be later. So that is really a challenge, and it's a lot to ask of young people who still haven't had a chance to develop their sense of, integrity or they're looking to other people to give them those norms. That's why I think the disappearance of all these people to inculcate and socialize them into this is going to be really terrible. But, for that reason, the next generation is going to be pretty much responsible for rebuilding this whole thing.
Mhm.
Like people like me and Mary and Andrew can will be there to help, design or say what needs to be done, but they're the ones who are going to have to populate and reconstruct this whole system that we've lost.
How can the FBI maintain operational independence while still being accountable to elected leadership without appearing aligned to any administration, kind of to your point, where we are?
Well, I mean, we've had a situation, we've had a structure in place that's worked quite well since the church hearings in 1975, which is there's, internal guidelines that the Department of Justice has policed and how FBI conducts investigations, but then there's robust oversight with these oversight committees. When you have a Justice Department that throws those internal guidelines out the window, and then when you have oversight committees who aren't willing to police the system, I think that's, I don't know where you go from there, but I think what we had in place, and I'd be interested if Andrew and Mary disagree substantially, I thought it worked. I think it was a good system. It required a lot of transparency and communication between the executive branch and Congress, so that and therefore with the American people as well. And I think the FBI hasn't been perfect even since 1975, but when it hasn't, it's come to light and it's been fixed and it's been addressed.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we can always do better. Like, I think of the building back, not meaning let's just go right back to where we were before, but let's try to be better in the future with the department and with the FBI. But I think right now it's tough for agents. I mean, the agents I talk to who are staying there, and those who have left and can talk about the way things were right before they left. I mean, they just don't know what's coming out of the director's office. Kesh Patel, I mean, he cares way more about like going to pro wrestling matches and stuff like that and flying around in his private jet than actually doing real law enforcement. And I think he's
flying around in his public jet.
That's right, not his private jet. Good point. Thank you, Andrew.
Our jet.
Yes, exactly. But our jet. But he, I think, he's trying to do what he can to stay on the good side of the president so he doesn't lose his job. And so he's going to do whatever he needs to do vis-a-vis other agents. And, they're trying to do their jobs. And if it runs sideways against something the president wants, they know they're going to be gone. So they've got to be prepared for that. So that was not the high note. So the high note again, juries, grand juries, judges. There's our notes. Yes, all the people who have their voices, don't be cowed, be brave. This is a time for courage.
The people in Minnesota who are on the
Yep.
street peacefully, I stress peacefully protesting, the people who are using a really important weapon protected by the First Amendment, which is your phone and taking videos. There's a reason that you see so many videos of ICE agents trying to stop people from taking videos, which, by the way, is protected by the First Amendment.
Yes, it is.
That is how the stories about Sosie Sellis, the individual who was shot by ICE in Minnesota, the reason he is not in jail and the case was dismissed is because of video. The reason that the story about Alex Preddy and his being a domestic terrorist who was going to engage, according to the White House, in that looked like he was going to engage in the mass slaughter of law enforcement. The way in which that is exposed is by citizens showing up and recording and understanding their rights in the same way that, as Mary said, the grand jurors were not engaged in jury nullification. They were engaged in the rule of law and looking at the facts and the law when the government tried to indict 6 members of Congress in an opposing party, which is pure authoritarian activity. Make no mistake about it. This is not hyperbole. Just that, as I said to Mary when we were talking about this, I can't believe we're at that point where we're having that discussion, where the Department of Justice thought to go in to try and indict 6 members of Congress for something that is a constitutional right they have, which is to speak. But those grand jurors did their duty. So there are many. This is the area where I can't say we're in pure authoritarian in terms of we may be what the government is trying to do, but you're seeing so many examples of citizens around the country asserting their rights and taking action that is a real lesson for all of us.
On that note, Mary, Asha, and Andrew, this has been an incredible discussion, and we're grateful for your wisdom and your time. We hope you will return to continue the discussion in the future, because I think there's a lot to talk about still. Thank you all for participating in tonight's panel. Please look for announcements of our March program coming soon, and be on the lookout for a brief survey of tonight's program in your email. If you value our program, like tonight's, for example, please consider supporting NFRPP. Visit our website, nfrpp.org, to donate. Thank you all, and good night.
Good night.